Hi folks, Dr. P here with a rather long and quote-filled discussion of cartoons, comic books and movies, games, and reality, how they all fit together. Many games that purport or pretend to be models of something are far from reality. They're more like comic books or even cartoons. And I want to follow up on that. It's a subject that's bigger than one video, but I am going to emphasize here comic books and RPGs rather than all kinds of tabletop games and all of the things that I've listed. So let's compare. In cartoons, no one ever gets permanently hurt. It's not even intended to appear real, like How to Train Your Dragon or Dragon's Race to the Edge. Virtually nobody dies despite them fighting dragons, fire-breathing dragons, and so on. Frequently in cartoons, there's no progression or change in the characters, as in, say, Saturday morning cartoons, but that's not always true. Comic books, including comic book movies, you see that fatalities are rare and injuries are uncommon, but there is some change or progression or regression, and no one, quote unquote, ever really dies permanently because you have multiverses. So Gamora of Guardians of the Galaxy died, but another Gamora turns up from another universe. And we might see other characters that have died turn up again from other universes. Then we have the real world and some novels. Other novels are more like comic books or cartoons, but many novels, there are lots of injuries and fatalities if there's conflict, and there's lots of change and progression, regression amongst the characters. So those are three different ways of doing things, and you can run RPGs those three different ways as well. Now, let me talk a little bit about comics. Is it still a big business? It certainly is in the movies, but perhaps not in physical or digital comic books. So I have some stats which are rather old, comparing the comic book business to the movie industry, the NFL, and so on. But the point is, it is a fairly big industry, or at least it is if you include the comic book movies. Now, my book, Game Design, was finished in 2011, but I think what I said in that book, which is still in print, by the way, is apropos here. So I'm going to quote some of it. Think of tabletop games as something like comic books, and AAA video games as something like movies. Both can be entertaining, both can tell a story. The comic book is much simpler, yet requires more imaginative effort from the reader than a movie, which is much more explicit because you're looking at the movie. Comics are also much cheaper to produce, but hit movies are seen by many more people than any comic book. Similarly, comics are produced by publishers without outside financing. A few people can create a comic book. To make a big video game, to shift a little bit, you usually need lots of people and you need to get financing before you start, just as for a big movie. So video games are different from tabletop games in that important respect, if you're making a big video game. Now I have quite a few quotes. This is from Brad Talton. The design of the game immediately draws players into its world. Players who are entering the world that your game presents will need a way to connect to the world. For players who read novels extensively, text and a few design elements are typically enough. However, with the proliferation of video games, television, and comic books, most gamers require some visual stimulus in order to really connect with the world you are building. I'll stop with a quote there and point out how important graphics are in video games and how important the visual and tactile look and feel of a tabletop game is important to many of the people who play it. Now to continue the quote, and to formulate that world from in their own mind. The people need the stimulation. The easier it is for players to see the world in their mind's eye, the easier it is to relate to the emotions of the characters and the challenges they face. Unquote. And we live in a time when lack of imagination steadily increases because people don't use their imaginations as much because so much is presented to them in a more or less finished format, like movies, as an obvious example, but things like G.I. Joe and Barbie and so on as well. In other words, you could say people aren't accustomed anymore to toys because toys, by their very nature, are something where you have to decide what to do with it and you have to use your imagination. And that is decreasing. Then we have a digression here because of the term graphic novels. There was a comment online, I don't have the name of the person, who said, I think this is lame. It's like comic books versus graphic novels. A bunch of people ashamed that they enjoy comic books. So rather than just man up or stop reading them, they called comics graphic novels so that they wouldn't be associated with those lowly comics. Now this reminds me a great deal of people who are ashamed of creating video games and want them to be recognized as art, so they won't be associated with that lowbrow stuff. This has never bothered me, but it bothers some people a lot. Now we also see changes over time. And I'm going to illustrate this with a quotation from Richard Corliss, who wrote in an obituary, I think it was an obituary of Charlton Heston, from start to finish, Heston was a grand, ornery anachronism, the sinewy symbol of a time when Hollywood took itself seriously, when heroes came from history books, not comic books. Epics like Ben-Hur or El Cid simply couldn't be made today, in part because popular culture has changed as much as political fashion, but mainly because there's no one remotely like Charlton Heston to infuse the form with his stature, fire, and guts, unquote. Now, Heston got a bad reputation when he turned from a liberal into the president of the NRA, but that's irrelevant to what he was as an actor. And of course, we're going back a long time to when heroes came from history books, not comic books. And that's one of the big changes that has happened. People don't like history. They ignore history, or they even imagine their own history rather than taking it as it is. They prefer wishful thinking, like comic books. As the graphics capabilities for movies have risen in the past several decades, I'd expect comic books to suffer. Comics require more imagination than movies and simply cannot match the glory for outstanding movie special effects. But then we had Marvel's outstanding group of movies that they are still making, although perhaps they're not as popular, that are taken from comic books. So comic books have got a new lease on life from movies, but they're different from comic books because they require a lot less imagination. I was surprised to find that overall comic book sales in dollars have been rising over the years, even as all these superhero movies have come out. And I've seen decreasing circulation figures for many superhero comics. And this is a long quote from, I lost the source, unfortunately. In comics, death as a plot point is a shibboleth that separates casual readers from true fans. The former know that, as long as the publisher continues, the characters will be back. The latter, the true fan, agree to be taken in, they accept the stakes every time, regardless of overwhelming evidence. The medium demands a curiously fervent suspension of disbelief. Stan Lee's superpower might actually be eliciting that special suspension from his audience. And you get much the same kind of thing in some kinds of RPGs or some RPG campaigns. If you were to actually kill a superhero, as in never bring them back, not even 20 years later, as part of some alternative universe cross-time reunion, it would be a massive breach of contract. But there's really no way of telegraphing that you're doing such a thing, because every conceivable protestation that this time it's really happening has already been used in the service of 100 false deaths of 100 famous characters. The only way you can deliver such a grand coup is slowly and outside the printed realm of the comics themselves. This again might remind you of some role-playing game campaigns. Richard G., a former comics creator, said, quote, "It takes forever to tell a story. What Stan Lee would put in 6 pages, now it takes 6 months." So you look at the sales. Marvel comics are now $4 a piece, and they're thrilled if the sales are over 30,000. When I was at Marvel, the whole world was different. We didn't have a single title. We had 75 titles. We didn't have a single one that sold below 100,000. We had the X-Men approaching 750,000. And that's not some special #1, or somebody dies, or changes costume, or someone gets married. It was every time. A lot of it was single copy readers. People weren't running around buying cases of it because it had a foil embossed cover. It was every issue. Of course, we had then ran into COVID-19, and comic stores were closed all over the country. The comic publishers moved toward digital distribution as their primary method. And quite apart from protestations about the direction the comics have taken, accusations that they're woke, whatever the hell that means, we've had some poor stories and sales in the comic industry. The printed and digitized comic industry, not the movies, is now in enormous trouble. And even the movies aren't doing as well as they used to. So I've tried to draw some parallels between comics and the role-playing games. Always keep in mind that in role-playing games, there are 2 ways to run them. One is a game, one is a storytelling machine. And the storytelling machines are more like comic books or even cartoons, and the games are more like novels in reality. And the twain do not meet generally. You play it one way or the other way. But despite the similarities with the comic book industry, I doubt the RPG industry will follow into near oblivion, but it will become more digitized. We see it already with people playing online using online software. Thanks for listening.